We're going over the book of Ezra, and I'm giving you a brief review, and then we'll go on to some of the new material. So remember that Ezra, who is a Kohen, and indeed the pasuk in Ezra gives you probably the longest yichus list in Tanakh, going all the way back to Aaron HaKohen, meaning it traces Ezra's unbroken yichus all the way back to Aaron HaKohen. And Chazal are mishabeach Ezra in an extraordinary way, which, you don't see it in the book of Ezra itself, but it says that Ezra is essentially a second Moshe Rabbeinu. That had the Torah not been given to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Klal Yisrael, would have been given through Ezra. And the big question becomes, Ezra did not come to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel or Persia, depends, until 1 year after the Beis HaMikdash was dedicated. In the 6th year of Daryavish was the Chanukas Habayis, and Ezra came in the 7th year of Daryavish. Why didn't Ezra come up with Zerubbabel? Right, Zerubbabel came up 19 years earlier, right? And Ezra, for those 19 years, remained in Bavel. So the Gemara says that Ezra had a Rebbe who was very old, and Ezra's Rebbe was Baruch ben Neriah. Baruch ben Neriah was a Talmud of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, and Baruch ben Neriah was physically not able to go because of age and illness, and therefore Ezra did not want to leave until his Rebbe was nifter. Now, the interesting question is, how do you understand that, right? Ezra stayed because of Baruch ben Neriah. Is it the idea that kashem that we say that you're allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael in order to learn Torah? There is such a thing. So kal v'chomer, you don't have to come to Eretz Yisrael if you have a Rebbe that is your direct connection to Torah. So did he stay because this is nichlal in the heter of lilmod Torah, because Rebbeim are not interchangeable, and the unique relationship he had with his Rebbe could not have been replicated in Eretz Yisrael? Or is it another aspect? Is it a question of kavod for the Rebbe? Meaning, is it because of Ezra's lilmod Torah, or is it because of the kavod that he had to his Rebbe? You can learn either way, but be it as it may, Ezra did not come until the death of Baruch ben Neriah, and that meant that Ezra did not come until the 7th year of Daryavish Hasheni, which was 1 year after the Chanukas Habayis. Ezra brought up a group of many Jews with him as well. We are not given the exact number, but it was not as big as Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel had a larger group. Ezra had a smaller group, but Ezra did bring up a group as well. And it's very, very interesting that the Gemara in Yevamos says there was some major halachic repercussions in the second aliyah of Ezra, and that is the pasuk records that when Ezra came up with people, he brought Kohanim, and he brought Yisraelim, and he brought even Mamzerim, he brought different psulim. It actually mentions that he specifically wanted to bring people who were pasul, take them out of Chutz La'aretz, so they would be under his supervision, and therefore, indeed, he made Bavel Seilas Nikia. Seilas Nikia means the purest flour. He purified, right? Those of you that may have learned Maseches Kedushin, either in Mishnah or Gemara, do you recall the phrase that starts the 4th parak of Kedushin, the last parak of Kedushin? Asara yuchsin olu mi Bavel. 10 family groupings came up from Bavel. Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim, Mamzerim, all sorts of different groupings. So what is the reference, Olu mi Bavel? So the Gemara in Kedushin explains, it is a direct reference that Ezra wanted to take not only the kosher Jews, so to speak, but even Mamzerim, who could not marry into Klal Yisrael. He wanted to remove them from Bavel, because he wouldn't be there. So Bavel didn't necessarily at that point have the Gedolei Torah that could supervise. And therefore it actually says he purified Bavel by bringing the psulim to Eretz Yisrael. Now, this actually has repercussions for generations. The Gemara actually said that people who come from Bavel had a purer family lineage than the people from Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael there were interminglings of various psulim. and this is the Asara Yuchsan Olami Bavel. But it is recorded in the Sefer itself that initially, when Ezra assembled his group, he did not have any Levium. He had Kohanim, Yisraelim, Mamzerim, all sorts of different types of people. He didn't have Levium. And he had to send a special message to surrounding towns that they should conscript Levium to go with him. So that is recorded in the Sefer itself. But the Gemara in Yevamos says there was a very interesting consequence of the Levium not showing up, and that is Ezra imposed a kanas on Shevet Levi, a kanas. Well, there was always a problem. You're imposing a kanas on the Levium that didn't show up, but the people who actually suffer are the Levium who did show up. I mean, okay, that's the nature of kanas very often. The people who are actually worst affected are b'davka, the innocent people, but Ezra imposed a kanas on Shevet Levi that henceforth maaser rishon would no longer be given exclusively to Shevet Levi. So a little explanation here. We know that the produce that grows in Eretz Yisrael, there is a chiyuv of truma and maaser. That's why kashrus in Eretz Yisrael is harder than America. In America, I can go to any supermarket and buy an apple or a banana. Here, that's not the case, because if it's not under any hashgacha, you have a problem with trumos and masros that have to be separated. Now, for various reasons, primarily connected to truma, we don't actually give the truma and the maaser to Kohanim and Leviim today. We let it spoil or wrap it up, etc. But certainly, ideally, trumos are given to Kohanim, and every year of the Shmita cycle, other than Shmita itself, there is, right, so truma, right, the truma that you give to a Kohen, again, just to review the basic halacha, deoraisa, there is no minimum quantity. If I have even 1,000 bushels of grain, I can separate one kernel, and that would deoraisa be a valid truma. Ein lo shiur. Rabbinically, however, truma gedola, as it's called, does have a shiur, and the shiur depends, strangely enough, on how generous you are. If you are a generous person, you should separate 1 out of 40. If you are an average person, 1 out of 50, 2%. And if you're a stingy person, it's 1 out of 60, right? So you actually have a range of ayin yafa, ayin ra, beinuni. It's a funny kind of halacha, right? A person goes to his rabbi and says, how much truma must I separate from my grain? So the rabbi says, well, are you stingy, generous, or average? Most people don't want to self-identify. Oh, I'm stingy. So it's kind of a strange halacha. But nevertheless, Chazal usually refer to most people as average, and therefore we can say that truma gedola is 2%. Okay, so that's every year. And until you separate that truma gedola, the grain is called tevel, with a tes, and there's an isur d'oraisa to eat tevel. Interestingly enough, and this is a lumdish question, even a kohen is not allowed to eat tevel. Now that's an interesting question, because once truma is separated, the kohen can eat truma. It's only a non-kohen that cannot eat truma. So you might have conceptualized that the problem of tevel is that there's truma mixed into the grain. But that's clearly not the reason, because if the only problem with tevel is the truma that's mixed into the grain, then logically that would mean a kohen should be allowed to eat tevel. Because what's he doing? He's eating the truma, he's allowed to eat the truma. So it's very, very clear that tevel is a separate autonomous isur, that until the proper things are separated, it's tevel. And tevel is usher not only to a Yisrael, but it's also usher to a Kohen. So every year, right, let's look at the 7-year cycle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and year 7 is Shmita. But years 1 to 6, Truma Gedola must be separated every year. I'll get to Shmita in a moment. After Truma Gedola, there is a 10% separation. That's called maaser, which means 10%. And that's called maaser rishon, the first maaser, and that is given to Levi, a Levi. Maaser rishon is given to a Levi. Now, I don't want to be overly mathematical here, but technically, it is 10% on the declining balance after you separated truma. So let's imagine you started off with 100 bushels of grain, and you're an average guy, so you give 2 bushels for truma. Now that leaves you with 98 bushels. So the 10% of the maaser rishon, a lot of people don't realize this, but the 10% of the maaser rishon is not 10% of the 100. It is 10% of the 98, because it's net, the separation of truma. So that would mean the maaser rishon is 9.8 bushels. Okay. Maaser rishon is separated every year of the cycle until we get to Shmita. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, in addition, there is a second maaser that is separated, and that, by the way, is also net of the maaser rishon. And what that second maaser is, this is a little more complicated, depends on the year of the Shmita cycle. In year 1, in year 2, in year 4, in year 5, 1, 2, 4, 5, it is called maaser sheni. And the maaser sheni is not given to anybody, but it is taken to Yerushalayim, and it is eaten in sanctity and purity in Yerushalayim. That's called maaser sheni. If it's too far to carry all that fruit, or that, so the Torah says you can redeem it on money. So the fruit now becomes mutter to eat wherever you want to eat it, and the money is taken to Yerushalayim, and you buy food in Yerushalayim, and it's consumed there. This is called maaser sheni, and it's year 1, 2, 4, 5. Year 3 and year 6, a second maaser is also separated, but it is given to the poor as tzedakah, and that is called maaser ani, and that can be eaten anywhere, right? They can eat it anywhere. Now, I want to point out that the Yisur Tevel remains in effect until everything is separated, meaning even if you separated the truma, and the only thing you didn't separate was maaser rishon or maaser sheni or maaser ani, it is still tevel, right? Tevel remains until everything that needs to be separated is separated. And the Yisur of tevel, as I said before, applies to Kohanim, Leviim, it applies to everybody. So you're going to hear, when you get in more advanced sugyas, you'll often hear a chakira. Is the Yisur tevel a separate Yisur, or is the Yisur tevel because of the truma and the maaser that is mixed in? I tell you the truth, I've heard this chakira, at least 50 years, this chakira, but it seems to me, just as a matter of common sense, it is not at all possible to define the Yisur tevel as based on the truma and the maaser that's mixed in, because if that would be the case, why would there be an Yisur for a Kohen or a Levi? So forget about this chakira right now, at least. If you ever hit it in the Shiur, you can talk about it then. But b'pashtus, we will assume that tevel is a separate, autonomous Yisur. Okay, so everybody got this. Every year is truma gedola. Every year is maaser rishon. In year 1, 2, 4, 5, there's a maaser sheni. In year 3, 6, there's maaser ani. In addition, from the maaser rishon, the Levi is supposed to separate 10% of that and give that to the Kohen, and that is 10%, that's not open, and that is called trumas maaser, the truma that you take from maaser. See, that's why you'll notice I use the phrase truma gedola for the 2%. It's called gedola because it is based on the total produce, as opposed to trumas maaser, which is only 10%. Okay, everyone got the general system. What happens on Shmita, year 7? So year 7, we're not allowed to work the land, but we are allowed to eat the produce. We are allowed to eat the produce of Shmita. But the produce of Shmita is exempt from trumos and masros. There is no law of tevel on the produce of Shmita. And the reason that is so is that the produce of Shmita is hefker. Anybody can come in. If you have an apple tree in your garden during Shemitah, I can go in and pick the apples. Of course, you can do that also. And if you try to stop me by locking your gate, you're over in Isser D'Oraisa, that the produce of Shemitah has to be available for everybody. When I say everybody, I don't just mean the poor. It's not a gift to the poor. It is hefker, even if you're a multimillionaire, it is hefker for everybody. And there is a general rule that things that are hefker are exempt from truma and maaser. Right, so if you find something hefker and you take it, a fruit or whatever it is, how you know it's hefker is another question, but let's assume you just know it's hefker. So you are exempt from truma and maaser, and that is why the produce of Shemitah is exempt from truma and maaser. Okay, these are generally ideas. Actually, it's actually very relevant to the Parshas of Shavua, not this week's Parsha, but Parshas Kisavo. Actually, Parshas Kisavo discusses this. So I'm giving you a little bit of a head start on the Parsha in 2 weeks, Parshas Kisavo. Now, here is what Ezra did according to the Gemara in Yevamos. Because the Leviim were not committed to coming to Eretz Yisrael, and Ezra had to kind of force a group of Leviim to come, Ezra enacted a kanas that maaser rishon shall no longer be given to Leviim, it shall be given to Kehanim instead. Now, there are two ways of understanding this kanas. One way of understanding the kanas is it should only be given to Kohen and not given to a Levi. In other words, Leviim were simply cut off. Or the other way of understanding it is that Ezra said you can give it to a Kohen and you don't have to, meaning the following. Under Torah law, maaser rishon could in fact be given to a Kohen simply because every Kohen is also a Levi. Which means, in theory, I could give my truma to a Kohen and I can give my maaser to the same Kohen. Because every Kohen is a Levi. By the way, that also seems to negate a yeshiva shechakira that makes the rounds. And that is a Kohen an enhanced Levi? Or is a Kohen like a newly created status in which he is menutak from being a Levi? Again, these are chakiras you're going to hear. Once again, just as a matter of common sense, if indeed maaser rishon can be given to a Kohen, even though the Torah says maaser rishon belongs to a Levi, the implication is very clear that a Kohen is an enhanced Levi. A Kohen is not a new status. A Kohen is an enhanced Levi. Okay, be it as it may though, so min ha-Torah giving it to a Kohen is fine, but generally you give it to a Levi. So the question was, when Ezra made a kanas, was his kanas that you should only give it to a Kohen? Or was his kanas that, let's go back to the original practice, that you can also give it to a Kohen? You don't have to focus on a Levi exclusively. So that's a machlokes, what Ezra's kanas was. But then there's another machlokes on top of that. And that is, was Ezra's kanas permanent? Or was Ezra's kanas only for that particular generation? So there are two different machloksim regarding the kanas of Ezra. Number one, what was the kanas? Only Kohen or Kohen or Levi? And the second is, does Ezra's kanas apply permanently? Now, today, neither of these shilas is that nogea l'maisa, because we don't give maaser rishon to either a Levi or a Kohen, so we don't need to decide it. But at a time when we gave the maaser to the Kohen or the Levi, we needed to have the psak and the machlokes rishonim exactly how we paskin. Yeah.
According to the opinion that Ezra can make the kanas to only a Kohen, how would the Levies survive? Because Parshas Ra'ed says given like a Levi.
Well, yeah, the Levi would survive by maaser ani. If the Levi was an ani, the Levi was an ani, right? So that's basically it. We're not going to give him that entitlement. Okay, so that's one interesting takana of Ezra. I had mentioned last month, I don't want to repeat everything Ezra made. Ezra, of course, also organized a very important body, which is not mentioned in the book of Ezra, but he was the founder of the body called the Anshe Knesses Hagadola, the men or the people of the Great Assembly. This was an assembly of 120 elders. under the original leadership of Ezra, and they made many, many takanos. They actually wrote the Shmona Esrei, the nusach of our tefillos, Kiddush, Havdalah, really all of these nuschos come from the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. And again, I don't want to review too much, but just to remind people, in Pirkei Avos, it mentions, the very beginning of Pirkei Avos, it talks about Moshe got the Torah Sinai, and it went down to Yoshua and the elders. And it finally ends with the Anshe Knesset Hagdola at the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash. And what does it say? Haim Amru Shleisha Devarim. The Anshe Knesset Hagdola said 3 teachings. Of course, they had many teachings, but these were their mission statement. These were their fundamental teachings. And one is Ahavi Masunim Badin. One should be deliberate and patient in judgment, meaning when you have to judge a case, a shaila, paskin on a shaila, or judge a case, take your time. Do not rush to judgment. It's very interesting that they considered this to be so important that this literally became enshrined as one of their 3 principles. Don't rush. When you rush, you make mistakes. If I could draw an analogy from emergency surgery in the military, I came across this, that you have army surgeons, people who have to do surgery in the middle of a war, on a battlefield. And sometimes they have to repair an artery, really life-threatening surgery. If it doesn't go right, the guy's dead. So the standard military instruction about repairing an artery is, you can do it in 1.5 minutes if you don't try to rush. Right? You can do it pretty quickly, but take your time. That's an interesting thing. You have 1.5 minutes, just do it. If you try to rush, what happens is you get mixed up, you mess up, you make mistakes. That's true in artery surgery, and that's true in Torah as well. So their first teaching is don't rush. Again, it is interesting how important this is. It's important, but you wouldn't have thought necessarily it's that important, and yet it must be up there because it's the very first thing they mentioned. Don't rush. The second is Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. This is a message for all the generations. Try to have as many students that you're teaching Torah to as you're able to have. Because you never know who's going to be the gadol, who's going to be the leader. You never know. Right? Don't just concentrate your efforts on small, but try to be marchiv and be marbitz Torah in the best way that you can. And the third teaching was asu siyag la Torah. We have to make fences around the Torah. And the example would be, a Nazir is not allowed to eat grapes or drink wine, but it's proper for a Nazir not even to enter a vineyard for the obvious reason. He sees the grapes. He may eat them, and that's the metaphor of a fence around the Torah. And as we know, the typical gezerah of Chazal, of which we have gazillions of them. Don't do X, lest you come to do Y, is essentially a fence around the Torah. In fact, this very year, as I mentioned the other day, we have an example of one of the most extraordinary fences around the Torah, and that is the first day of Rosh Hashanah is going to be on Shabbos. And even though the Torah says there's a mitzvah to blow the shofar, we do not blow the shofar. And I had mentioned the Machlokes Bavli and the Yerushalmi, but just going with the Bavli, the reason we don't blow the shofar is a rabbinic concern, lest you take the shofar out to learn how to blow it, and you carry it from a Rishus HaYachid, a private domain, to a public domain. So what did the Chachamim tell you? They took away from Klal Yisrael the fulfillment of a mitzvah d'oraisa in order that it shouldn't lead to a desecration of Shabbos. Now that's extraordinary. That's a very unusual fence, actually, because that's a fence that takes away a mitzvah. Most fences of the Torah do not take away a mitzvah. An example of a standard fence would be chicken and milk, basar b'chalaf. Now the Torah says do not cook a goat in its mother's milk, and Chazal understand that to mean that the Yisur d'oraisa of meat and milk only applies if it's a mammal, a milk-producing animal, like a cow, a sheep, or a goat. so I can't have a cheeseburger or the like. But to have chicken and milk, chicken, right? Chicken, a bird, any bird is not a milk producing animal. So deoraisa, chicken and milk is okay. And in fact, the Gemara records that there was actually a Tana who paskined that it was mutter, and in his city they would have chicken and milk, chicken and butter, whatever it would be. But we paskin that the Chachamim made a gezerah: do not have chicken and milk, lest you come to have meat and milk, because people look at chicken as meat, etc. Fish and milk, other than some Sfardim have a minhag because of sakana, but fish and milk is mutter. Right? You can have fish and butter. That's not a problem. Although I say some Sfardim are machmir for mystical sakana reasons, but chicken and milk is an isur d'rabbanan. That's a classic example of offense. And the truth of the matter is, the whole idea of waiting periods between meat and milk is really a fence around the Torah, because the isur of basar b'chalav d'oraisa is only to eat meat that is cooked with milk. I mean, d'oraisa, if you actually went to d'oraisa, I could have a glass of milk and a hot dog. They weren't cooked together. So basar b'chalav has many, many fences. The idea of waiting periods, and again, whether it's 3 hours, 6 hours, whatever it is, but waiting periods is midrabanan. Chicken and milk is midrabanan, etc. So that's a fence around the Torah. So these are the three teachings of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. One is be deliberate in your judgment. Try to have many, many Talmidim and make fences around the Torah. But making fences around the Torah is not only a directive to the Chachamim, it's also a directive to us personally. And that is, we should have our personal fences. And that is, every person knows which circumstances are temptations for them, which will drag you down. So even if there's no halacha that says you can't be in a certain place or do a certain thing, you sometimes have to have your own fences. If this is going to drag me down, if this is going to compromise me, if this is going to adversely affect my ruchnias, right? Make your fence. Make your fence around. B'li neder, don't make nadarim. And I don't know if any of you are prone to nadarim, but I get too many shilas about, oh, I made a vow, that I never do it again. I can't. Don't make vows. Please do not make nadarim. It is Shlomo HaMelech, who was much smarter than we are, said, it is better that you don't vow than that you make a vow and you don't keep it. And yeah, we do have hataris nadarim that if l'maisa you did it, but that's a b'diavad. You don't make a vow with the kavana that if it's too hard, I'll just do hataris nadarim. If you anticipate it's going to be too hard, and you should anticipate it's going to be too hard, you don't make the vow. So when I say make a fence around the Torah, I am not talking about any type of vow. You say b'li neder, but as I say, but it is appropriate to have your own fences in life, so you don't cross the line, right? You don't cross lines, because lines are drawn in the sand and they constantly shift. So the closer you get to the red zone, the more likely it is you'll fall into the red zone, and therefore better keep away. And I don't want to sermonize per se, but it's interesting that some people say sometimes that Orthodox Judaism or Halachic Judaism is very prudish and old-fashioned, and seems to assign a predator role to males. We have this rule: can't have yichud. I can't be alone in a room with a woman. I can't, shake her hand or whatever it is. Like, what's going on here? What? You shake a woman's hand, so you're going to rape her? I mean, what is all of this business here? By the way, when people say Judaism is discriminatory against women, it's really discriminatory against men, because the valued suppositions that it's making about males are very insulting. It says, you can't be alone with a woman because for sure you're going to do something really bad. Hey, why do we have mechitza? Mechitza is not because, the women are inferior. Mechitza is because we are going to have constant sexual violence. So if you have any complaint about Judaism, men should complain more than women. So the people say, what is this thing about yichud? This thing about negia, casual touching, high fives, shaking hands. So what's interesting is that, over the past years, really past several decades already, There has been a lot of litigation in corporate America, really around the world, about sexual harassment. For some reason, when I was growing up, we pronounced it harassment. I don't know when the pronunciation changed, but now it's pronounced harassment for whatever reason. And as a result, a lot of Fortune 500 companies, because of fear of litigation, have employee manuals. And it is so funny. You take General Electric, Westinghouse, IBM, Apple, and you look at an employee manual, and it almost looks like a translation of the Shulchan Aruch. It'll say something like, men should not be alone with women after hours behind closed doors. Women are reminded that they should dress in a dignified, of course, obviously not all the halachas of sneas, but they should dress in a dignified way that is not provocative. People should be careful not to engage in casual touching, hugging, kissing, and the like. And like, why is Apple or IBM, why are they translating parts of the Shulchan Aruch? Well, the answer is, of course, they're not translating parts of the Shulchan Aruch. They're coming to these ideas on their own, not because they're God-fearing, not because they want to keep Hashem's halacha, but because they recognize that when you don't have boundaries, even the innocuous can slide down into dangerous things. So it's a funny thing that as decadent as our society is, they've come to a recognition that some of these boundaries are actually very necessary. So what people might criticize as being old-fashioned and being prudish is actually something that even the secular world, to some degree, recognizes as important. And that goes back to the notion of siyag l'Torah, to make fences around the Torah. That even if God permitted something technically, but one doesn't want to get too close to the red zone because you never know. And again, without getting involved in specific stories, unfortunately, there are stories of even rabbis crossing the line. Starting off with very good intentions, starting off with l'shem shamayim, and I will give it to them, l'shem shamayim. But sometimes a rabbi has a yetzer hara. A rabbi might sometimes think that the rules don't apply to him because he's a rabbi, meaning, no, I can do this because I'm not going to come to that. Yeah, the average person comes to that. Okay, but I won't come to that. And yet what happens is, yeah, you do come to that. And the truth of the matter is, it's not just rabbis. We can go back to Shlomo HaMelech himself. In last week's parsha, the Torah says, the king shall not have a lot of wives, no more than 18, lest they distract him and take him away from his responsibility. A king should not have a lot of horses, lest he return the people to Egypt in order to get all of those horses. Now, the Gemara in Sanhedrin remarks, the Torah often does not give reasons for commandments, just gives a commandment. So they just say the king shouldn't have a lot of wives, the king shouldn't have a lot of horses. Why does the Torah give a particular reason? Because the Torah foresaw that Shlomo HaMelech would make the argument that, hey, if the Torah says don't have a lot of wives because they will distract you, that's not going to happen to me. I'm smarter than that. So Shlomo has 1,000 wives. What happens, of course, is they attract him even to Avodah Zarah. Shlomo HaMelech says, the Torah says don't have a lot of horses, lest you return your people to Egypt to buy good horses. Well, I won't do that. And yet, at some point, he got involved in horse collection, and the best horses were in Egypt. In other words, the Torah gave a reason because the Torah wanted to show us that even when you think the reason doesn't apply to you, it actually does. And Shlomo HaMelech's mistake is, again, as I say, is repeated over and over and over again in later generations, including today. So, rules are rules. I mean, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows better than us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's wisdom is very, very great. And Chazal's wisdom is greater than we can imagine. And when people make judgments that these fences and these rules are primitive and they don't really apply to me, they're setting themselves up for failure in a big time way. Okay, so be it as it may, this goes back to the third teaching of the Anshe Knesset Agdola of Asu Siyag La Torah, and Ezra was the founder of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Now, again, forgive me for reviewing, but again, some people are new. What is the relationship between the Anshe Knesset Agdola and the Sanhedrin? Which now the Sanhedrin is 70 judges, and the Nasi, Anshe Knesset Agdola, is 120. Are these the same body, different body, overlapping body? What exactly is the relationship between the two? So the Rambam seems to say that the 120 of the Anshe Knesset Agdola was a temporary expansion of the Sanhedrin itself. And that is, the Rambam says, the Sanhedrin is permitted to expand itself. To include, in other words, if there's a need to make takanos and gezeros that have to be accepted by Klal Yisrael, and perhaps they won't be fully accepted unless you have a broader base of participation, the Sanhedrin could expand itself to whatever number they authorized. And therefore, according to the Rambam, the 120 included whoever were the 71 members of the Sanhedrin, plus those extra people. It seems, however, that the Anshe Knesset Agdola was a temporary body in the sense that when somebody died, they were not replaced. Meaning eventually the Anshe Knesset Agdola died out. They were not replaced. It was not a self-perpetuating body. And that is why the next Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, Shimon HaTzadik was the last survivor of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. He was a Kohen Gadol in the relatively early years of the Bayit Sheni, simply because the body, people didn't replace the body as people died. The Sanhedrin, of course, you do replace. When a Dayan dies, the Sanhedrin appoints a successor, but Anshe Knesset Agdola itself, the extra augmentation, as people died, they died, and it was not replaced. I'm sorry, did you want to say?
He was Ezra's successor?
Huh?
He was Ezra's successor.
I'm not sure if he was Ezra's successor because there may have been a few people in between. He was not the immediate successor. By the way, there's even a shaila, was Ezra Kohen Gadol? Because the emes is, Ezra shows up the 7th year of Daryavish, which is the 1 year after the Chanukas Habayis. Now, there's already a Kohen Gadol officiating, and he's given a name. Yehoshua ben Yehotzadak is the Kohen Gadol. And he was the Kohen Gadol when Ezra came, even though in terms of Gadlus B'Torah, there is no question that Ezra was much, much greater. In fact, some even say that another reason why Ezra didn't show up till after the Chanukas Habayis is he didn't want to take the job away from Yehoshua ben Yotzadak. So once Yehoshua ben Yotzadak was firmly established, then Ezra could show up, not to bump him. But the Rambam, however, does write that at some point, and I don't know when because the chronology is very murky, Ezra in fact did become a Kohen Gadol as well, even though that is not recorded in the book of Ezra or the book of Nehemiah. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll see you later and have a good day.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.